or Western culture, how there's a lot of ethnocentrism and the tendency, which is the tendency to favor one group opposed to another. And it talks a little bit about that, and contrast it to how in some countries like Japan and things like that, they have a more group oriented idea of society, and some specific examples between individualism and collectivism, which is what those are called, are just like, in individualistic countries, or with that sense, there's more focus on individuals. The self is determined by personal traits. Um, Private self is more important and things like that. Whereas in other societies, it's pretty much the exact opposite, where there's a more focus on groups. Self is defined by group terms. Public is most important, and just things like that. So, and that's on figure 12.1 on page 395. There's just a whole list that goes over just the main contrasts between the two. So there's that is. And also there's a study that's in this chapter that talks about where American students said that they were more, and whatever they would say was more based on self, whereas Western students that were studying in Western societies, like not Eastern students who are studying in Western societies, like a Chinese student would say, I'm involved in chess club or group activities. All right. And also, it talks a little bit more how times, kind of spent in these countries, and there's a list on page 396, figure 12.3, which talks about the average daily time that adolescents use in different regions of the world. When I read this, I kind of felt bad because I spend way more time not doing schoolwork than most Americans, Europeans, or East Asian students. But other than that, it's pretty interesting statistics, but I'm not going to really go into the numbers. But just an overview of that. Um, United States adolescents spend a lot of time, 4 to 6 hours, doing work time, which is paid labor, household labor, and schoolwork. Europeans spend pretty much the same time, and East Asian students spend 6 to 8 hours, mostly doing schoolwork. When it came to free time, the United States had the biggest. They spent 6.5 to 8 hours doing that. So it's pretty interesting statistics. Later in this chapter, it talks about rites of passages. And a rite of passage is a ceremony or ritual that marks an individual's transition from being a child to adult, pretty much. So in some cultures, that's being able to perform adult practices, just expressing sexuality and just things like that. And it's kind of expressed in this chapter that Western society really doesn't have a big importance on rites of passage and things like that. So, and another interesting statistic or thing that I found was sexual intercourse was greatly increased by adolescents who had done the rite of passage. By 70% of adolescents, have had sex before they were adults, or by the end of adolescence. And some examples of this are it talks about some Congolese boys with their painted faces. It talks about Apache Native Americans. It even talks about a bat mitzvah. So these are just things to keep in mind. It also talks later in this chapter about what is socioeconomic status. And that refers to a grouping of people with similar occupational, educational, or economic characteristics. So just probably a similar group, I guess, to paraphrase it and make it easier to understand. Later, like a sub part of that in this is poverty, and poverty has kind of gone into depth in this chapter. It talks about how all the struggles that adolescents go with poverty, um, and the obstacles that they have, such as, their health isn't going to be as good, their skills, like just they have alienation from other groups and other higher socioeconomic statuses, and it's just a lot of things like that. And actually, one of the statistics here says that living in distressed neighborhoods, like it shows that it's highest among African American, a little lower than Latinos and non-Latino whites. It's definitely the lowest, and there's a big gap between those ethnicity and poverty and how they're related and things like that. And some of the things that these adolescents who suffer from poverty that they experience is just violence, instability at home. They get less social support. They watch more TV. They have less structured, like free play, which is sports and things like that. They read less books, have less computers. They live in dangerous and physically deteriorating neighborhoods, so it's like less homes and things like that. Okay, it talks about a little bit, just briefly, about feminization of poverty, and that just means where women, have more poverty than men. Like in most cases, like it just talks about low income. Sometimes this happens because divorce or low income or being a single mother or things like that. So some of the benefits this chapter talks about of countering poverty, there's actually a lot. It's pretty straightforward. But it talks about an experiment, and it actually goes quite in depth about the New Hope experiment. And it affected, pardon me, and it affected adults more than the adolescents, but the plan that they did was a 2-generation intervention, which means it affected adolescents and it affected adults. And most often it had better effects. The adolescents read more, they did better in school most often, and just things like that. So that's obviously really important.